um, okay, so a couple of announcements before we start with our day, and this is coming from the higher ups, that we are starting a National Honor Society at VAVA, which is a big deal. I believe all you need to have is like a GPA of a 3, which is I think like a B, so A's and B's. 3 volunteer hours, which aren't very hard to get. You could, volunteer at a local pet shelter or something, or even with your church if you go to a church. And then 2 letters of recommendation, and this can be from anybody. So this can be from a family friend. This can be from, hi Elizabeth. This can be from, I don't know, a coworker if you have a job right now. This could be from a minister or something as well, or also, of course, a teacher. So if you're interested in joining the National Honor Society, this is pretty cool that VAVA is now offering it. And the next thing is that there are no Class Connect sessions this Friday. That means we're not going to have our Class Connect either on Friday, which is a bummer. And the slide kind of moved around, so it's covering things up. But there is a Regent University campus tour happening on Friday and the virtual career day. So all this stuff on this slide is high school related. And if you can't make it out to anything, the virtual career day looks like it's going to be really interesting. Okay, so the essential question for today is, what has to happen for the art world to change? So the key here, of course, is the art world. Not the greater world, but maybe the perception of how we see art. Viewers, artists, sculptors, what has to happen for us to change? And as always, this is no right or wrong answer here. Ooh, nice. So enough people have to become open to the change. Yes, so maybe art has a different meaning or serves a different purpose, right? So art itself has to start changing, and then people have to be willing to accept it, for sure. All right, so if you guys each want to take your own line here, this is a crazy different image compared to what we've seen in our past works. Like, we are jumping leaps and bounds in a different direction. But these are, the bottom line is pointing to a word there, and then the upper line is pointing to a face. If you guys can give your best idea of what you think is happening. Once again, no right or wrong, you're just looking at the clues and trying to find a meaning. Face of an important person. Great. Maybe your description too can also be about where you think these images came from. Words from a newspaper. Excellent. So we are looking at a very early collage. So this is from a very long time ago. You can see here that the color change of the paper is not only from the age of the paper getting older, but also from an earlier time in which newspapers and magazines were often on a slightly darker paper than what we recognize as today. So what makes you wonder about this piece? Why is there so much stuff going on? All the different things, right? This is entirely by design, and this is really by the Dada movement. So this is the actual title up here. I'll read it out to you. Cut with a Dada kitchen knife is the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany. So most people just know this as cut with a Dada kitchen knife. Like, that is its nickname because it is so long. And this is also, of course, translated from German. And all the words in here are, in fact, from German newspapers as well. And this is totally representing of the movement. So this is an art movement actually called Dada, believe it or not. I'm just going to circle right here. I like this piece. All my students always like this piece because the name of the art movement is in the freaking artwork. That doesn't happen very often in the art world. But the Dada art movement really changed the art world dramatically, right? It makes it super convenient. It changed the art world dramatically because the world in general had been changing. Can you guess what was happening in the early 1900s in Germany, in much of Europe? World War I, exactly. So we are in World War I, which for the first time we are seeing death and destruction on a massive scale. And can you guys guess why that would change the art world? Yes, definitely. You both are right here. That psychological impact from war had literally changed the expectations of people. So imagine seeing that death and destruction out on, your own fields or your own land. Seeing huge portions of your town leave and die or be incarcerated for whatever reasons, and then all of a sudden, do you think you'd want to just paint pretty pictures of flowers anymore? No, right, for sure. All of a sudden, artists were shaken because they were people along with everyone else. In fact, many of these artists were called to fight in the beginning, and then many actually ended up escaping because they were not considered desirable. And this happens really with every major war. You'll see kind of a reactionist thread in which artists start to protest. But this piece is meant to overwhelm you, for sure, and is at the heart of the Dada movement. So the Dada movement was a movement that was based in irrationality. So they did not want to be rational. They believed that rational and logical thought is what led to our great massive destruction, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. But they believed that the rational and logic that led to invention and coming up with our modern tools and technology will always be used for military application, will always be used to help us kill one another a little bit better. So we can think about that too in our own situations. I mean, this is essentially the founding principle of Iron Man as a whole narrative, all technology being used for military purposes. But you can think about your own technology today, like the GPS in a phone. It wasn't given, it was solidly used for military purposes, and they would actually, for common or the average citizen, the signal was not specific. You had to get military clearances until like the Clinton era. So in the 90s, that was the first time in which we got to use accurate GPSs, whereas the military, of course, is using it first. Your computers, any technology that you have encountered has always been used for military application first. and then eventually it's made for the consumer. You know, sometimes it goes backwards, but in the end, the Dada artists were pacifist as a reaction. So they believed what they saw was, you know, the war to end all wars. They believed what they saw was the worst that could ever happen in human history, and that things had to change. And I think that they were right in that the rest of the world agreed things have to change, but they didn't completely change how they thought they would. You know, for example, World War I is not the war to end all wars. We know that now for sure. So how they got their name, the Dada artists actually would meet together, many of which ended up meeting in Switzerland, which was always neutral. So that's a common place that a lot of people escaped to during this time. And they would meet at these different cafes and coffee shops, you know. This is when the cafe and the coffee shop is really starting to become very cool, very savvy. People forget that, like, Albert Einstein used to hang out in cafes as well or talk with other theorists. That was like a common place for discussion and intellectual growth. But the Dada artists would put on these performances and stuff, and they were all based in shaking up the art world and being irrational. They got their name by taking a German dictionary and stabbing a knife through the cover. And the very tip of the blade landed on the word Dada, which actually means like a rocking horse in German. So it's the name of the kid's toy became their name. Violent, very violent, right. You know, you can imagine the disheveled nature of these people looking to make something that actually truly means something. So by being irrational, they thought they were doing the rational thing. So these guys are definitely, they were considered rebels of the art world, for sure. This is actually made by the artist Hannah Hoch. This is, finally, we got some lady artists really going on here. We have actually, in the 1800s, there were quite a few female artists. Not many were breaking the rules, though, most of which were kind of a part of a movement or a lesser part of the movement, mostly because of how society was structured. But you can also see how shortly after World War I, there was really a push for the women's vote to happen. The culture in the art world is changing. Still definitely, at this point, male-dominated, but women are rising up to be considered equals. And, you know, there still is the fight today for true equality. But this is, it surprises a lot of people to hear that Hannah Hoch was, in fact, a woman in this work because it's considered so masculine with the gears and things like that. But her work really did shock a lot of people of the generation. So this next video here, I recommend that you turn your volume down because it starts out being really loud and kind of shocking. It's a long video, but only watch to 2 minutes and 18 seconds. And when you come back, tell me what has surprised you about the art movement. Shocking, everything. We're entering a time now in which almost all of our artists can be seen on camera, which is really exciting. We see evidence that they were real people. We can even watch them making some things. Their nonsense poetry. Yeah, yeah, for sure. They were kind of shocking. And they were definitely a rebellious movement, and they caught a lot of attention. But honestly, not everyone liked their stuff at first. Even now, it's hard to truly like it, but even though we can kind of relate to it a little bit more. Yeah, yeah, it was that I believe was a segment also created by Dada artists, but it put you on edge for sure. Like they did nonsense, but they weren't completely silly. They were ridiculous, but they weren't like peaceful. Yeah, that's okay. Like a lot of people didn't like it very much either, but eventually. So what is the true thing that will actually squash a rebellion? This was a rebellious art movement. They ended about 7 years later. It was a very short art movement. But what actually will destroy a rebellion in the end? Dissent among members? Maybe. This is something more external. Think about a friend that you might have that considers themselves a rebel, right? Or they like to do things that are out of the norm, and they want people to know that it's out of the norm. What will make them stop doing that unusual thing? Exactly. Yeah, they were accepted in the end. So people started to copy them. And especially in the US, different artists in New York were starting to have their own happenings, and people started to imitate them, and thus literally they were no longer cool, so they dissolved. I always think it's interesting when you see rebel plots in movies and things like that, and all they have to do is really be accepted, and then that whole the whole rebellion will be squashed. Um, but yeah, so they became accepted by the art world, and then they left. They were like, Dada is no longer alive. And even today, I got invited from by an artist friend to a happening, is what they called their events. So they were called happenings. A happening in Richmond recently, and I was like, do you know the history of this? This is really interesting. But it was like a mix of poetry slam reading and live painting and stuff. So people are still definitely inspired by this movement, even if they don't consciously know its origin. Honors question for this week is about social reaction. So how can art become a protest? By this I mean, what does the art need to do in order to be considered a protest? And it's, once again, it's an opinion, and I will post it after this session today for the forum. But it has to make everyone mad. I think it would probably have to. Mad is a tricky emotion for sure. Invoke emotion at least. Yeah, that's true. And I don't think it has to make everyone. I feel like someone should agree with the protest side, right? There should at least be a one person that agrees with the subject. But yeah, it's definitely directed. It definitely is meant to be seen for sure. And and to invoke some sort of emotion. I agree. All right, so this is a contemporary artist here named Aldwith, kind of like Cher, like the single name. And we're seeing here a much more organized but similar color scheme collage happening. And the title of this is What's Love Got to Do with It? Maybe you know the song that it's referencing. Yeah, so looking at modern day collage, how far have we come? How is this like the new standard for what collage should be compared to Hannah Hawke's original? It's still very busy, but this artist is definitely doing some different things. Right? Shape and pattern is a lot more important. I say also like the image density is becoming more important. When we see a collage, we want it to be a collage. We want to see a lot of images now. Even if it feels a bit overwhelming, there's definitely some order in the chaos, for sure. Okay, so you guys, we'll just do a free-for-all for this one. The style and the process. The process, well, obviously it's the collage process. Collage actually comes from the French word, I believe it's coller, which means to glue. And it's only been an official art form since 1912. So it's not that old of an art form, as it turns out. And the style, I mean, you're allowed to say things like random. Get out with a knife. Yeah. So something important to note, these artists just didn't stop working after they broke up, after the band broke up. Most of them became what we now know as surrealists, which we'll look at the next time we meet, which will be next week. Yeah, next week is a normal week for us. We only have 2 normal weeks left. And we have the spring break sort of wrap around half weeks in between that. But we'll go into surrealism next week for sure, before we get into the modern day graffiti pieces that we see. Okay. Oh, this is quite a compare and contrast here. In fact, it's going to be pretty hard to compare this today. I would say the artists are similar, maybe. Both are rebellious in some way, for sure. Order versus chaos, right? I wonder if they were both to meet, how much they would have in common. Because in reality, you know, they're both kind of dealing with different concepts of realism here. The Dada obviously are shook up and have a different perception of reality from Courbet. Now the one movement I didn't really get into because of our gap week was the Impressionist movement that was happening in between here. And have you guys heard of Impressionism before? It's probably one of the most famous movements. If you haven't heard of it, I'll drop an image real quick to give you as a reference. You have, okay. So Impressionism, when I said like we're no longer want to have pictures of just pretty flowers and such, Impressionism was definitely caught up in that. And Van Gogh came right after this. I'm going to minimize this image. So just as a frame of reference here, Impressionists were also rebels, for sure, of the art world, but they were quickly accepted because their work was really pretty. It's really interesting what you can get away with if you make something pretty. Just a little heads up there. If you make a pretty poster, people will look at it for a little bit longer and then think about what your meaning is. So this is happening right here, and then Van Gogh comes right after Impressionism. And just to give that as a frame of reference. And then, so Everyone Loves Starry Night, I'll put that in there. And I would have gone into that last week, but our class was canceled. So I'm just going to try and make a little nice, convenient timeline happening here. So before Dada came around, these two works, something like this, was the expectation that people were having for art. They wanted something whimsical, they wanted lots of movement. Yeah, maybe they were actually interested in psychology right now, so we're thinking Sigmund Freud is also around at this time, the interest in psychology. So Van Gogh, even though he had died, his work was actually being accepted right now. And then came along the Dada, completely shaking up everything. So Van Gogh definitely looks rebellious compared to here, definitely looks rebellious compared to apples and pomegranate. But when you put his works right next to the Dada, it looks pretty in comparison, right? Like not so rebellious anymore. Yeah, right? It's interesting how our frame of references have changed. And even now, like, our works that we create today, like, look so wildly different compared to cut with the Dada kitchen knife. Okay. Oops. It's not apples and a pomegranate. I go through these things, and I should just stop putting titles in places because I can't always get all of those lined up. Okay. So how do you think this work impacted the art world? Even though I feel like we've been talking about that the whole time. Shocking, different, rebellious, for sure. And these guys ended up really shaking up what art could be. Right, introduce something new. And then after that, everything started being new. Also, a word that they use for this era of art is avant-garde, which means always to like seek out the new thing and to be rebellious in a way. So it's seeking out the new thing, but not necessarily in fashion, to be avant-garde. And lastly, how does learning about this work impact you? You can be rebellious too, for sure. Now we're definitely in this era of what do we have to do something new? You don't think this does impact you? So we don't have to like a work to learn from it, right? And that's where this is interesting when you always get into the history fields of art, is that sometimes we're finding, yeah, rebellion only lasts as long as it's rebellious, for sure. The works that we study in art history are often not the most beautiful or the most aesthetically pleasing, but they're always considered the most important, so they're the game changers. So that's what we tend to really study in art history, which is interesting because you're not really studying what the common people looked at. You're looking at who changed the idea or who made waves. So it'd be an interesting story if we like flipped it around and just looked at like what the common people were buying in World War II before or World War I before the Dada artists came along. And it'd probably be a lot more simple and pretty for sure. It's not really until the 1950s and 60s that people really stopped leaving, I would say, pretty art behind so much. And I say that in quotes, pretty art. So when they're buying art for their houses, they're starting to look for abstract for sure. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording button now.